The idea that Roman soldiers wore red clothing is deeply rooted in popular culture, with countless depictions in movies, games, and even historical paintings. So the question arises, did Roman soldiers really wear red, or is it just a convention that developed over time? That's what we're going to explore in this video. In Roman culture, red had a direct connection to the Roman god Mars, the god of war, who was invoked by Roman soldiers before battles. Mars was often depicted wearing red, a color that also evoked the bloodshed in battle and the fire of combat. Beyond that, red carried a connotation of authority, strength, and leadership, making it a fitting color for those who represented the might of Rome. Red garments were believed to instill courage among troops and to symbolize vitality and readiness for combat. The color also held ceremonial and spiritual importance, being worn during rituals that called upon the favor of Mars before significant campaigns. Ancient writers like Martial and Plutarch frequently mentioned the use of red among Roman soldiers and leaders. For example, Martial, in one of his epigrams, mentions that Gaul, a region conquered by the Romans, also used red, a color that pleased both soldiers and farmers alike. Similarly, Plutarch recounts an episode in the life of Fabius Maximus, in which the Roman commander displayed a scarlet tunic as a sign of leadership before an important battle. Other historians also noted that generals and centurions sometimes used red as a visual signal on the battlefield, allowing their soldiers to recognize their commanders amid the chaos of combat. However, the biggest influence on the colors of soldiers' clothing was the availability of dyes. Contrary to what many believe, red was actually a relatively inexpensive color to produce in ancient Rome, especially since it was derived from plant-based sources such as madder roots and other local vegetation. The process of extracting dye from these plants did not require complex techniques or rare ingredients, which made common red a practical and affordable choice for mass-producing clothing for lower-ranking soldiers and other middle and lower-class citizens. The availability of materials meant that even large armies could be outfitted in garments that carried at least some degree of uniformity in hue, though shades often varied from one batch to another depending on the quality of the dye and the local production methods. On the other hand, scarlet red, a more vibrant and long-lasting color, was significantly more expensive to produce. This deeper, richer shade of red was often made from dyes extracted from the Kermes insect or similar sources, and the production process was both time-consuming and costly. As a result, scarlet was typically reserved for high-ranking individuals and military officers such as generals, tribunes, or even emperors. These officers wore the vivid scarlet to distinguish themselves from common soldiers and to project authority and prestige. In official ceremonies, scarlet tunics and cloaks became powerful symbols of command, power, and divine favor. But even though red was a common color among Roman soldiers, it was not necessarily a universal standard. During the early periods of Roman history, the legions did not have a standardized uniform. This was largely because in the early Republic, soldiers were citizen soldiers serving temporarily, often providing their own weapons, armor, and clothing. Consequently, the appearance of the army was far more varied than what we imagine today. Soldiers' tunics differed in color, fabric, and quality depending on their personal wealth and social standing. Those of lesser means might have worn plain wool or linen tunics in natural shades of white, beige, or brown, while wealthier soldiers could afford dyed garments in red or other colors. Some of this diversity is confirmed through archaeological and artistic evidence. For example, a fresco from Pompeii shows a Roman soldier wearing a white tunic, demonstrating how color variations were not unusual. Such depictions suggest that practicality often dictated clothing choices more than any official mandate. Natural dyes faded quickly, meaning tunics might appear lighter or duller over time, further contributing to the lack of visual uniformity within the ranks. The The standardization of military dress intensified only during the Imperial era, when the Roman army evolved into a professional standing force. Even though the Imperial army introduced greater uniformity in armor and equipment, there was still room for variation in color and design. Each legion developed its own distinct visual identity, often reflected in its shields, banners, and tunics. This visual differentiation helped foster unit pride and cohesion, allowing legions to be easily recognized during parades, campaigns, or in the midst of battle formations. These colors were not limited to red. Depending on the legion's region of origin, the time period, and local resources, tunics could include a wide range of shades. Units stationed in different provinces might use whatever dyes were available locally, leading to garments in shades of reddish-brown, ochre, or even muted yellows. For auxiliary soldiers, who were non-Roman troops recruited from the provinces, the variety was even greater. These units often wore a mix of traditional attire and Roman-supplied clothing, reflecting both their cultural heritage and the practical realities of supply logistics. This meant that auxiliary forces could appear in a spectrum of colors, including blues, greens, browns, and off-whites, depending on the local sources of dye and the economic conditions of their home provinces. Many auxiliaries came from regions rich in natural pigments, and their uniforms reflected these local resources. The Roman army, far from being strictly uniform, was a tapestry of regional diversity, blending Roman practicality with provincial tradition. Therefore, we cannot definitively say that Roman soldiers only wore red clothing. The color of their clothes depended on numerous factors, including a soldier's rank, the region he came from, the role he performed within the army, and the availability of materials and dyes. Over time, red became the most recognizable color associated with Rome, but it represented only part of a much more complex and varied reality. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video. They could include a wide range of shades depending on the region, the unit, and the time period. And for auxiliary soldiers, non-Roman troops recruited from the provinces, the colors could be even more varied. This was common since auxiliary units often wore their own traditional attire or clothing supplied by the Roman army, but without the strict standardization that characterized the Roman legions. This could include shades of blue, green, or brown, depending on the local sources of dye and the economy of the province the soldiers came from. Some provinces were rich in natural dye materials, allowing for more distinctive coloration, while others relied on simpler, earth-toned fabrics. Thus, uniforms across the empire reflected the resources and traditions of each region. So we can't definitively say that Roman soldiers only wore red clothing. The color of their clothes depended on many factors, like the soldier's rank, the region he came from, the role he performed, and the availability of materials. The diversity in color and material was a natural outcome of an empire that spanned continents, climates, and cultures. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video. Red in Roman culture was more than just a color. It represented symbolism, utility, and practicality, all at once. It was associated with blood, warfare, and the god Mars, the divine patron of Roman soldiers. The color red carried an air of command and strength, symbolizing valor and the readiness to shed blood for Rome. High-ranking officers and generals often embraced red to display leadership and authority, as the color visually reinforced their connection to Mars and the power of the Roman state. Lower-ranking soldiers, by contrast, wore tunics that reflected the materials and dyes available to them. Most of these dyes were derived from plants, such as madder roots, which produced various shades of red or brownish red at a relatively low cost. This made common red a practical option for outfitting large numbers of troops. Scarlet, however, was a much more vibrant and costly hue, created through a more elaborate process that involved rare and expensive dyes extracted from insects. Because of this, Scarlet clothing became a mark of elite status and was worn primarily by commanding officers or used in ceremonial contexts to signify prestige and authority. Uniformity within the Roman military began to emerge during the Imperial period as the army transitioned into a professional institution. However, even this standardization never completely erased the visual differences among legions. Each legion maintained its own sense of identity, expressed through distinct combinations of shield designs, banner motifs, and tunic colors. These differences helped create a sense of pride and belonging within each unit, and allowed legions to be distinguished from one another both in battle and in formal processions. Auxiliary troops, drawn from the empire's diverse provinces, brought their own cultural traditions and styles of clothing into the Roman military system. This integration of regional attire added even more color and diversity to the army's overall appearance. For instance, auxiliaries from Northern Europe might wear garments dyed with local plants that produced muted greens or browns, while those from the eastern provinces might favor brighter or more intricately patterned fabrics. The combination of Roman practicality and provincial influence created a striking visual diversity that reflected the empire's vast multicultural character. Thus, red was iconic, but not universal. It represented status, authority, and symbolism, yet it also served as a practical choice for large-scale military outfitting. Over time, its association with Mars and warfare elevated it to a color of legend, while everyday variations continued across the empire. Historical depictions tend to exaggerate the prevalence of red because it creates a bold and unified visual image, especially in art, films, and media. In reality, the Roman army's appearance was far more nuanced and practical, shaped by supply logistics, regional resources, and social hierarchy. Red was indeed easy to produce for the masses, while scarlet marked the elite. Soldiers' clothing could range in color depending on their rank, the local economy, and the geographic origin of their unit. During the early Republic, when soldiers provided their own gear, tunics were typically made from wool or linen in natural, undyed shades. As the army professionalized during the Imperial period, greater consistency appeared in military attire, yet complete uniformity remained elusive. Auxiliary and non-Roman troops often wore garments that reflected their provincial origins, sometimes adapted to Roman styles but still retaining elements of local tradition. This fusion of cultural and practical elements mirrored the empire's ability to incorporate a wide range of peoples and customs into its military structure. The variety of colors and designs served not only functional purposes, but also symbolized the unity of diverse regions under Roman authority. Roman soldiers' tunic colors were influenced by status, function, and the accessibility of resources. Not all Roman troops wore red, and the popular image of a uniform crimson army is more symbolic than factual. Red's association with Mars and war ensured its prominence in art and propaganda, but the daily reality of military clothing was much more varied. Scarlet tunics were reserved for commanders and ceremonial displays, while the common ranks wore simpler, less vivid reds or other natural shades produced from inexpensive dyes. Even within a single legion, uniformity was far from perfect. Environmental wear, fading dyes, and the use of locally produced fabrics meant that tunic colors could vary widely between soldiers. Some tunics might appear deep red after recent dyeing, while others would fade into dull pinks or browns over time. Early Republican soldiers made their own garments, leading to even greater differences, while Imperial standardization introduced more consistency without erasing individuality. Auxiliary troops, representing the empire's far-reaching provinces, brought their own traditional clothing styles, fabrics, and colors into the army, adding another layer of diversity. Together, these influences created a complex and colorful visual landscape across Rome's vast military system. The iconic red may dominate popular imagination, but history reveals a more intricate picture, one of diversity, practicality, and adaptation within one of the most powerful armies the world has ever known. Red's prevalence was symbolic, practical, and visually striking in both art and media. It was not just a color, but an emblem of Roman identity and military pride. High-ranking generals often wore the most vibrant scarlet tunics, a shade associated with leadership, valor, and divine favor. This brilliant color was achieved through expensive dyes that required skill and rare ingredients to produce, making scarlet garments a visible mark of authority and prestige. Common soldiers, on the other hand, typically wore tunics dyed with more affordable plant-based red pigments. These tunics were often made of wool and dyed using roots such as madder, producing muted reds or earthy tones that were practical for everyday military wear. The contrast between bright scarlet and common red highlighted the clear social and hierarchical distinctions within the Roman army. Uniforms were more than just practical clothing. They were powerful symbols of unity, loyalty, and discipline. Each color carried meaning, linking soldiers to their unit and reinforcing their collective identity. Yet the colors varied widely between legions, provinces, and auxiliary units, revealing the empire's vast diversity. The iconic red tunic seen in popular imagery represents only one aspect of this complex visual culture. Different regions had access to different dyeing materials, leading to a wide range of hues, from deep crimson to brownish red or even pale orange. Some soldiers wore undyed wool, while others had access to slightly more colorful fabrics, depending on their local resources and the efficiency of their supply chains. Practicality, rank, and culture shaped tunic color far more than propaganda or regulation. Even as the Imperial army moved toward greater standardization, variety persisted throughout the empire. The Roman world was vast, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, and each region contributed unique materials and dyeing traditions. A legion stationed in the damp climates of the northern provinces might have favored darker, more subdued colors, while those serving in the Mediterranean could afford lighter or brighter fabrics. Uniform colors reflected the materials available locally, the economic conditions of each province, and the function of the soldier within the army, rather than any universal artistic convention. Red, however, served both symbolic and practical purposes for the legions. Its visibility made it an ideal color for battlefields, where coordination and identification were essential. The color also carried a deep spiritual meaning, representing Mars, the god of war, whose power and protection were central to Roman military culture. Scarlet, the richest shade of red, was reserved for officers and commanders, symbolizing authority and command presence. Common red, more subdued and easier to produce, indicated utility and accessibility, allowing for mass outfitting of soldiers without excessive cost. Auxiliary troops, recruited from across the empire, added yet another layer of diversity. They often wore clothing inspired by their native traditions, sometimes blending Roman designs with provincial fabrics and dyes. This infusion of local culture made the Roman army not only an instrument of conquest, but also a reflection of the empire's vast multicultural fabric. Uniformity in the Roman army was therefore relative. Identity and appearance could vary significantly from one legion to another, depending on the region and available supplies. Color was more than mere decoration. It reinforced hierarchy, discipline, and group cohesion. The variation in tunic colors subtly communicated a soldier's position within the military order, his role in the legion, and even his geographical origin. While Roman commanders valued the image of unity, the army's practical reality was one of adaptation and resourcefulness. Even popular culture, through films and historical art, tends to exaggerate the image of the Roman army, clothed entirely in brilliant red. This visual uniformity is striking but historically misleading. The real Roman army was far more complex, characterized by diversity, practicality, and symbolic meaning woven together. Red undoubtedly stood as a visual statement of war, divine favor, and military power, yet its use was grounded as much in practicality as in ideology. Scarlet tunics were reserved for officers and elite ranks, distinguishing them from ordinary soldiers whose clothing reflected everyday realities of supply and affordability. Every shade of color in the Roman army carried meaning, whether symbolic of leadership, born of necessity, or derived from local resources. Red was iconic, but never universal across Roman legions. So the next time you see Roman soldiers in media, remember the story behind the colors. Historical texts remind us that tunic color often depended on the resources at hand, local tradition, and the soldier's status within the military hierarchy. Legions adapted their attire to the availability of dyes, the terrain they fought in, and even the climate. Ordinary soldiers might wear brighter or duller shades depending on the season or the freshness of the dye. On the battlefield, red remained one of the most visually striking colors. It created an imposing image, inspired fear in enemies, and strengthened unity among comrades. Despite its prominence, red was never an absolute requirement. Scarlet continued to be reserved for higher-ranking officers and ceremonial occasions, reinforcing visual hierarchy within the ranks. Auxiliary troops from distant provinces maintained distinctive traditional attire, showcasing the cultural diversity of the empire. For Roman soldiers, color symbolized far more than simple fashion. It reflected rank, function, and regional origin, embodying both the power and complexity of the Roman world. Red was indeed iconic, symbolic and practical, but the Roman army as a whole was far more colorful, dynamic, and diverse than popular culture has led us to believe.